What deathbed confession really shocked you? To my grandmother, a very sweet woman who I thought never had a bad bone in her body, confessed something to me on her deathbed that shattered my image of her. But that wasn't the shocking part. The real shock was when she said that the man had been married to one of her closest friends, and that the affair didn't end until her friend died suddenly in a car accident. She even admitted that. For years, she had wondered if the accident had been caused by her friend finding out about the affair. I still can't process that this kind, loving woman carried that kind of guilt for most of her life. My grandfather was a gruff, no-nonsense guy, but as he was nearing the end, he had this strange moment of clarity. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I'm not your real grandfather." Turns out my grandmother had been pregnant with someone else's child when they got married, and no one in the family knew. He raised my dad as his own, but apparently never felt the need to tell anyone the truth until that moment. It completely changed the way I looked at him and my family history. I worked as a nurse for a while, and one of my patients, who was in his 80s, made a confession that I'll never forget. He said that during World War II, he had been stationed in France and that he had a child with a local woman. He never told anyone about it, not even his wife, and for years, he had lived with the guilt of abandoning his child and their mother. He said that he always wondered what happened to them, but never had the courage to find out. I could see the regret in his eyes as he told me, and it was heartbreaking to watch him carry that weight to the grave. A close family friend of ours was on his deathbed when he admitted something that left everyone in the room speechless. He told us that, back in the 1970s, he had been involved in a hit-and-run accident that killed a man, and he had been driving drunk and panicked when it happened, so he just sped off and never reported it. Yet he said that he had lived with the guilt for decades and couldn't die without telling someone the truth. The police were called, but there wasn't much they could do after so many years. It made me wonder how many people out there are living with secrets like that. My uncle, who had always been the life of the party, made a confession right before he passed that made me question everything I knew about him. He admitted that he had stolen a significant amount of money from his parents, my grandparents, back when he was in his 20s. They had saved up that money to buy a house, and they never figured out where it went. They just assumed it had been lost or misplaced. My uncle said that he had gambled it all away in a single weekend and never had the courage to tell them. The worst part, my grandparents never got to buy that house, and they struggled financially for years afterward. My great aunt, a very quiet and religious woman, confessed to me one day that she had secretly been a member of a cult in the 1960s. She said it was during a time in her life when she felt lost, and the group had promised her all the answers she was looking for. She eventually left after realizing they were taking advantage of people, but she never told anyone about her involvement, not even her husband. It shocked me because she had always been so doubt and judgmental of people who were into weird things. I guess we all have our skeletons. A co-worker of mine told me about her dad's death confession. He was a police officer and apparently had covered up evidence in a major case that led to someone being wrongfully convicted. It happened early in his career, and while he hadn't been the one to frame the person, he had gone along with it and kept quiet to protect his fellow officers. He said it haunted him for years, but by the time he thought about coming clean, it was too late, and the person had already served their sentence. My coworker said she had no idea what to do with that information. My mother was a strict, no-nonsense kind of person, and when she was dying, she told me that she had been in love with someone else her whole life. Not my father, but a man she met before she married him. She said they had this brief, passionate affair, but circumstances pulled them apart, and she ended up settling down with my dad because it was the right thing to do. She never told him and spent her entire marriage wondering what could have been. It really threw me because I had always seen her as this practical, unemotional woman, but it turns out she had this huge secret passion hidden away all those years. I used to be a paramedic, and one time I was with a guy in his last moments. He was clearly panicking, not so much about dying, but about what he'd done in his life. He kept saying, "I didn't mean to kill her," over and over again. He wouldn't say who, when, or how, but it was clear that he had lived with that guilt for a long time. I reported it to the police afterward, but without any details, there wasn't much they could do. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, though. It was like his entire life had been leading up to that moment, and he was terrified of what came next. My great uncle was a war veteran, and he never really talked about his time in the service. But on his deathbed, he confessed to something that I still can't believe. He told me that he had killed civilians during a mission, women and children. It wasn't ordered, but it happened in the chaos of battle. He said that it was something he could never forgive himself for, and that it haunted him every day of his life. Hearing him say that broke my heart because he had always been a hero in my eyes, and I never imagined he carried such a dark secret. My grandmother confessed to me on her deathbed that she had another child before she married my grandfather. She had been in love with a man who left her when she got pregnant, and she gave the baby up for adoption. Yet she never told anyone, not even my grandfather. She said she had always wondered what happened to that child and whether they had a good life. What was so shocking to hear, because she had always been such a family-oriented person, and the idea that she had the secret child out there was hard to wrap my head around. I once sat with an elderly man in the hospital who confessed that he had spent most of his life as a con artist. He said he had stolen from people all across the country, using different identities and scams to get what he wanted. He even admitted to faking a few of his own injuries to get sympathy and money. What shocked me the most was how unapologetic he was. He didn't seem to regret any of it, just wanted to get it off his chest before he died. It was one of the strangest experiences of my life. So my father confessed to me on his deathbed that he had been having an affair for most of my childhood. He didn't say who it was with, but he did say that it was someone close to the family. My mother never found out, and I don't think my siblings ever had a clue. It made me look at my parents' marriage in a completely different way, and I still don't know how to feel about it. Part of me wishes he hadn't told me, because now I'm stuck with this secret that I'll never be able to share. So my neighbor, who was like a second father to me growing up, confessed to me on his deathbed that he had once stolen a large sum of money from his best friend. The friend had been a business partner, and they had a falling out over something. In retaliation, my neighbor had stolen the money and used it to start his own business. His friend never found out, and they eventually made up, but the guilt of what he had done stayed with him for the rest of his life. A friend of mine's grandmother confessed that she had been married once before, but her first husband disappeared under mysterious circumstances. She said they had gotten into a fight, and the next day he was gone. She never reported him missing and eventually remarried. She said she had always been afraid that someone would come looking for him, but no one ever did. The family was shocked to hear this, because she had always been such a quiet, unassuming person. So one of my dad's friends, who was always the quiet, stoic type, confessed on his deathbed that he'd been part of a major bank robbery in the 1970s. It shocked everyone, because he was the last person you'd expect to be involved in something like that. He said he didn't do it for the money, but because he had fallen in with the wrong crowd at the time. He had been living with that secret for decades, and no one ever suspected a thing. It makes you wonder what else people are hiding behind closed doors. My grandfather, who I had always known as a man of integrity, dropped a bombshell on me when he was dying. He told me that during his time in the military, he had stolen a large shipment of valuable goods and sold them on the black market. He used the money to fund his life after the war, including starting his own business. He never got caught and lived his entire life with that secret. It completely changed the way I saw him, and it's something I still struggle to reconcile with the person I thought he was. So one of my great uncles admitted to me just before he passed away that he had accidentally caused a fire that killed several people when he was younger. It happened at a warehouse where he worked, and he had been careless with some flammable materials. He panicked and fled the scene before anyone realized he was responsible. For years, he lived with the guilt, but no one ever figured out he was to blame. The worst part, he kept working at that same place for years after, pretending like nothing had happened. My neighbor's grandfather told me something once that really unsettled me. He said that he had been involved in an illegal adoption ring back in the 1960s. He worked as a driver, picking up babies from desperate mothers and delivering them to wealthy couples who paid large sums of money. And he didn't know where the babies ended up or what happened to them after the transactions were made, and he carried the weight of that guilt for decades. He never told his family, and it makes me sick to think about how many lives were ruined by that operation. A man I took care of during his final days confessed that he had been embezzling money from his company for years. He worked in finance and had been siphoning off small amounts of money that no one ever noticed. By the time he retired, he had amassed a small fortune, but he said the guilt of living a lie had eaten away at him. He never told his wife or kids, and they all believed he was a hardworking, honest man. Hearing that made me question how many people out there are living double lives like that. So my aunt admitted to me on her deathbed that she had been responsible for a hit and run accident when she was a teenager. She was driving without a license and hit a pedestrian late at night. Instead of stopping to help, she panicked and drove off. The person died, and it was ruled an unsolved crime. She lived her entire life with that guilt and never told anyone, not even her husband. It was shocking because she had always been this law-abiding, rule-following person, and I never would have guessed she was hiding something like that. One of my dad's cousins confessed to him on his deathbed that he had stolen a large sum of money from their family business decades ago. We said it was the reason the business went under, and no one had ever figured out what happened. He said he had gambled it all away and never had the courage to confess until he was dying. It tore my dad apart because he had spent years blaming himself for the business failure, only to find out it had been his cousin all along. I once heard about a man who confessed on his deathbed that he had been living a double life. He had a second family in another state that no one knew about, 2 kids, a wife, the whole 9 yards. He would travel for work and spend time with his other family, and no one ever suspected a thing. He said he had always intended to come clean but never found the right moment. And then years passed, and it became too late. His first family was devastated, and I can't even imagine how his second family reacted. My grandmother confessed to me just before she died that she had secretly taken out a large loan in my grandfather's name and lost all the money gambling. My grandfather never knew, and they had spent years struggling financially because of it. She said she had always felt terrible but was too ashamed to admit it to him. I had no idea she had been hiding that kind of secret, and it completely changed the way I saw her. A close family friend of ours admitted to me that he had been involved in some pretty shady dealings during the Cold War. He worked in a high-level government position and said he had passed classified information to foreign agents on multiple occasions. He had been blackmailed into it, but he said that didn't make him feel any better. He carried that guilt with him his entire life and never told anyone until the very end. So my uncle, who had always been a pretty shady guy, made a deathbed confession that left everyone in shock. He admitted that he had been running an illegal gambling ring for years, using his connections in the local community to keep it under the radar. He said he had made a lot of enemies along the way and had lived in constant fear that someone would eventually take him out, part that made me realize that the quiet, unassuming man I thought I knew had been living a dangerous double life. A former coworker of mine once told me that her father had confessed to killing someone just before he died. He had been in a bar fight back in the 1960s, and things had gotten out of hand. The other man died, and he had managed to cover it up with the help of some friends. He never faced justice for it, and she said it completely changed her view of him. I can't imagine what it must feel like to learn something like that about your parent right before they die. One of my best friends was taking care of her dying grandmother when she confessed that she had once stolen a baby. She had been working as a nurse in the maternity ward and had taken a newborn home with her one night. She raised the child as her own, and no one ever questioned it. The real parents had been told that the baby died, and they never knew the truth. My friend was absolutely horrified to hear that and has struggled with the guilt of knowing ever since. My stepfather's father admitted to me on his deathbed that he had once robbed a bank. He had been young and desperate for money, so he and a few friends planned and executed a heist. They got away with it, and he used the money to start a legitimate business. He said he always lived in fear that someone would find out, but he managed to keep it hidden until his final days. It was so shocking to hear because he had always been this upstanding, law-abiding man, but clearly, that wasn't the full story. A family friend of ours was dying of cancer, and just before he passed, he told his wife and kids that he had fathered another child with a woman he had an affair with years ago. None of them had any idea, and it left them devastated. The child had apparently been raised by the other woman without him ever being involved, but he said he had always felt guilty about abandoning them. It was a heartbreaking revelation, and I can't imagine how his family felt after hearing it. So my great-grandfather confessed to my father that he killed a man in duel back in the early 1900s. He had always told stories about being a man of honor and fighting for what was right, but apparently the duel had been over something petty, and he had been haunted by it ever since. I said it had been a dark mark on his soul, and he hoped that confessing it would bring him some peace. Hearing that changed the way my father looked at his entire family history. So one of my cousins admitted to me on his deathbed that he had been involved in organized crime for most of his life. He had always played the role of the quiet, law-abiding citizen, but apparently he had been working as a courier for a major crime family, delivering illegal goods and money all over the country. He said he had never been caught and had managed to keep it hidden from his family for years. It blew my mind to think that he had been living that kind of double life. And my grandmother, who was always so sweet and kind, admitted just before she passed that she had once poisoned a neighbor's dog because it kept barking all night. She said she had felt terrible about it afterward, but didn't know how to make it right. I was absolutely floored by that confession because she had always been an animal lover, and I never would have guessed she was capable of something like that. A friend of mine's father confessed to him on his deathbed that he had been involved in a major fraud scheme at his job, and he had embezzled millions of dollars over the course of his career and had managed to cover it up for decades. My friend had always looked up to his dad as this hardworking, honest man, so it was a huge shock to learn that he had been living a lie. It made him question everything he thought he knew about his family. One of my old neighbors admitted to me that she had been involved in a cult when she was younger. She said they did some pretty horrific things, including animal sacrifices and strange rituals, but she managed to escape before things got even worse. She never told her family or friends about it, and she said it was something that haunted her for the rest of her life. My grandfather, on his deathbed, revealed to me that during his time in WWI, he was involved in a secret mission where his unit had to eliminate civilians in a village that was suspected of collaborating with the enemy. He said it was the darkest chapter of his life, and he had never been able to shake the guilt. The confession stunned me because he had always been so proud of his military service, and I'd never imagined that he'd been carrying that burden all these years. My best friend's dad confessed to him as he lay dying that he had an affair with his wife's best friend for almost 15 years. He had always acted like the perfect, doting husband, and his wife never had any idea. It tore their family apart when it came out, and the fallout lasted long after his death. His wife was devastated to learn that her marriage had been built on lies for so long, and it made me wonder how many other people live with those kinds of secrets. A close family friend admitted to me just before he passed that he had been involved in several cover-ups during his career in law enforcement. He said there were a few cases where powerful people in the community were involved in serious crimes, but instead of facing justice, they had pulled strings to make sure everything was swept under the rug. He had gone along with it because he feared for his job, but the guilt ate him alive for decades. My great-uncle confessed to my mom that when he was a teenager, he had accidentally killed his younger brother in a hunting accident. The family always believed it had been a tragic accident, but he admitted that it was actually due to his carelessness. He had been showing off with the gun, trying to impress his friends, and the gun went off. The family never knew the truth, and he carried that guilt with him for over 60 years. A former coworker of mine told me her grandmother confessed on her deathbed that she had been responsible for the death of a neighbor's child. The kid had wandered into her yard one day, and she was so angry that she hit him. The blow caused him to fall and hit his head, killing him instantly. She panicked, and with the help of her husband, they covered it up. The family always thought it had been an accident, but hearing that she had hidden something so dark for decades gave me chills. I once heard a story from a nurse who said that a patient admitted to her just before he died that he had been a serial arsonist in his youth. He had set fire to several buildings in his town, causing a number of deaths, but he had never been caught. He said he was drawn to the flames and couldn't help himself, but after the last fire resulted in the deaths of a family, he stopped. No one ever suspected him, and he lived a quiet life until the day he passed away. A distant cousin of mine admitted to his wife on his deathbed that he had been cheating on her with her sister for years. The two women had always been close, and his wife never suspected a thing. It devastated the family and left a rift that has never really healed. It was shocking to hear because I had always thought of them as the perfect couple, and it made me wonder how many other families have similar secrets lurking under the surface. My step-grandfather, who was always this strict, no-nonsense guy, told me just before he died that he had spent time in prison for manslaughter when he was younger. He had gotten into a bar fight and things had escalated. The other man died from his injuries, and my grandfather was sent to prison for a few years. He never told anyone in the family about it, and everyone thought he had lived a squeaky clean life. It was a huge shock to find out that wasn't true. One of my high school friend's dads confessed on his deathbed that he had killed a man during a robbery gone wrong when he was in his 20s, and he had been part of a gang, and they were robbing a store when the owner tried to fight back. My friend's dad shot him and fled the scene. He said he had spent years fearing the police would catch up with him, but they never did. His family was stunned by the revelation, and it completely changed how they saw him. A patient I once took care of admitted to me that he had fathered a child with his wife's best friend, and no one had ever found out. He had always been a devoted father to his own children, but this secret child had grown up without ever knowing who their real father was. He said it had eaten away at him for years, but he couldn't bring himself to confess until the very end. It was heartbreaking to hear, and I wonder if the child ever found out the truth. My grandfather told me a story just before he passed away that really shook me. He said that during the 1960s, he had been part of a mob that lynched a man accused of a crime he didn't commit. My grandfather wasn't the one who killed him, but he said he stood by and did nothing as it happened. He had been haunted by the memory for decades and had never told anyone. I was horrified to hear that he had been part of something so awful. A woman I used to work with told me that her grandmother had confessed on her deathbed that she had switched babies in the hospital. Apparently, she had been a nurse and was angry with a particular family for some reason, so she swapped their newborn with another couple's baby. She lived with that secret for her entire life, and the real parents never knew what had happened. It makes me wonder how many other dark secrets are hidden in the history of hospitals and maternity wards. A close friend of mine shared with me that her dad had confessed on his deathbed that he had secretly been a drug dealer for most of his life. He had always worked in construction, but apparently he had made most of his money by selling drugs on the side. So none of his family had any idea, and they were shocked to learn that their father, who had always seemed like a hardworking, law-abiding man, had been living a secret life. A distant relative confessed to my family just before she passed away that she had killed her abusive husband in his sleep. Everyone had always believed he died of natural causes, but she said she had poisoned him after years of suffering under his control. She never told anyone because she was afraid of going to jail, but on her deathbed, she wanted to finally be free of the secret. It left the whole family in shock, and it made me realize how much people can hide behind a seemingly normal life. A guy I used to know from college shared that his father had confessed on his deathbed to being part of a human trafficking ring in the 1970s. He had been involved in smuggling people across borders and forcing them into slavery. His father had always been a quiet, unassuming man, and no one in the family had ever suspected him of being involved in something so horrific. It completely shattered my friend's view of his father, and I can't even imagine how he deals with knowing that now. One of my uncles, who had always been this tough, no-nonsense guy, told me before he passed that he had once killed a man during a street fight. It had happened when he was younger, and he said it was in self-defense, but he had never reported it to the police because he didn't trust them. He carried that guilt with him for decades, and it changed the way I saw him. He had always been the type to push people away, and now I understand why. A woman I once worked with shared a story about how her grandfather admitted on his deathbed that he had sabotaged a rival's business, leading to their bankruptcy. He had been jealous of their success and had done something underhanded to ruin them financially. No one ever found out, and his family had always thought of him as an honest businessman. Hearing that made me realize how far people will go to protect their reputation, even if it means destroying others. So my neighbor's mother confessed on her deathbed that she had hidden a family fortune from her siblings for decades. Apparently, their parents had left behind a large inheritance, but she had taken it all and never told anyone. Her siblings had always struggled financially, and she had lived a comfortable life off the stolen money. It shocked the whole family, and it made me wonder how many other family feuds have been started over secrets like that. A friend of mine told me a chilling story about his father's deathbed confession. His father had admitted to being involved in a murder-for-hire scheme when he was younger. He had worked as a driver for a group of hitmen, helping them get in and out of places without being caught. He said he had witnessed some horrific things but had never been directly involved in the killings. Still, the fact that he had been part of something so dark was enough to leave my friend reeling. One of my old neighbors confessed to me just before he passed away that he had been involved in a pyramid scheme that had ruined the lives of dozens of people. He said he had gotten in over his head and didn't know how to stop, so he kept roping in more victims. So by the time it all fell apart, he had already made off with a small fortune, and he never faced any legal consequences. It was a shocking revelation, especially because he had always seemed like such a stand-up guy. The woman I used to work with shared with me that her father had confessed to having an affair with her mother's sister for over 20 years. It had been a closely guarded secret, and no one ever suspected a thing. When the truth finally came out on his deathbed, it tore the family apart. So the shock of it all made her question everything she thought she knew about her family, and the betrayal from both her father and aunt was something she struggled to forgive. My aunt shared a confession from her mother, who on her deathbed admitted that she had faked her entire childhood to escape a traumatic upbringing. She said she had created an entirely new identity, fabricating stories about her family, her past, and even her accomplishments. The real story was far darker, involving abuse and neglect that she had hidden from everyone, including her own children. This revelation shocked our family, as we had always believed her to be the strong matriarch with a perfect life. A former colleague told me about his grandfather's confession on his deathbed, where he revealed that he had been a part of a notorious gang in the 1960s. They had committed several robberies and even hurt people during heists. The family had always thought of him as a quiet, peaceful man who lived a humble life after leaving that world behind. Learning that he had been involved in such violence was shocking, especially considering how much he had talked about the importance of family and honesty. A family friend shared a chilling story about her father, who admitted on his deathbed that he had deliberately caused a car accident that killed a rival businessman. He had been angry about a deal gone wrong and thought it would send a message. The family had always believed it was an unfortunate accident, but hearing that he had orchestrated it shattered her view of him completely. It made me realize how deep the layers of human nature can go, often hiding dark secrets behind a facade of normalcy. A friend of mine shared that his mother confessed on her deathbed to committing a serious crime. When she was younger, she had been involved in a robbery that turned violent, and someone had died as a result. She had spent years living in fear of being caught and never revealed her past to anyone, even her children. When she finally admitted it, it rocked his world, as he had always looked up to her as a strong, moral figure. It left him questioning everything about their family history. A close acquaintance of mine told me that his grandmother revealed on her deathbed that she had been a part of a cult in her younger years. She had been brainwashed into believing that the group's teachings were the truth, but after leaving, she spent decades hiding her past from her family. The confession left everyone shocked, especially since she had always preached about living a good and moral life. It made me think about how people can change and how easily they can be influenced by others. A neighbor recounted a story where his mother confessed just before she passed away that she had been involved in a cover-up of a serious crime committed by her brother. He had killed someone during a bar fight, and she helped him hide the evidence. It was an explosive confession that left the family divided, as they had always thought of her as an honest person. The truth changed the way they viewed family loyalty, and it created a rift that never fully healed. An old friend confessed that her father revealed on his deathbed that he had been responsible for the death of her childhood pet. He had run over it in the driveway but was too ashamed to admit it, so he made up a story about it running away. The truth devastated her, as she had always cherished the memory of that pet, and realizing her father had lied for years hurt more than she expected. A co-worker shared a shocking story about his mother, who confessed that she had been married before marrying his father and had a child from that marriage. She had never told anyone and claimed the child died in an accident. The truth, however, was that she had given the child up for adoption after leaving her first husband. Hearing this confession changed his perspective on family and trust, leaving him questioning the stories he grew up with. A family friend confessed that their grandfather had been involved in organized crime and had even killed a man during a botched job. He carried that secret until the end, and the confession revealed a darker side to someone they had always viewed as a kind, gentle old man. It made them realize how complex and multifaceted people can be, often hiding dark truths beneath their surface. A woman I knew shared that her mother confessed to her just before she passed away that she had been involved in a hit-and-run accident when she was younger. The guilt had haunted her for decades, and she had never admitted it to anyone, fearing the repercussions. The revelation left my friend reeling, as she had always seen her mother as a law-abiding citizen, and now she was forced to reconcile that image with this dark truth. One of my friends recounted a story about his grandfather, who confessed on his deathbed that he had been part of a plan to assassinate a political figure in the 1970s. He had never followed through, but just the thought that he'd once contemplated something so serious and dangerous was shocking. It made my friend question what else his grandfather had hidden throughout his life. A woman shared that her husband confessed just before dying that he had cheated on her multiple times during their marriage. He said he had never meant to hurt her, but had always felt tempted. The confession shattered her perception of their life together, leaving her to question their entire relationship and the love he claimed to have for her. Oh, my aunt once told me that her best friend revealed on her deathbed that she had been married to a mobster and had helped him launder money for years. So the truth had remained hidden for decades, and when it finally came out, it left everyone stunned. My aunt had always known her as a sweet, kind woman, but learning about her past was eye-opening and made my aunt reflect on the complexities of human nature. A distant relative once told me that her mother confessed just before dying that she had manipulated their family into believing she was terminally ill to get attention. It turned out she was completely healthy and had created a web of lies over the years. The fallout from that revelation was intense, as the family had sacrificed so much for her fabricated illness, and the betrayal left deep scars. A friend shared that his father admitted on his deathbed to being involved in a conspiracy that led to the wrongful imprisonment of an innocent man. He had testified against the man out of fear for his own safety and spent the rest of his life regretting that decision. The confession left my friend feeling anger and heartbreak for the man who had lost years of his life due to his father's actions. A neighbor told me about her father's shocking confession on his deathbed, where he revealed that he had been a con artist for most of his life. He had swindled countless people out of money through various schemes, and it was all for the thrill of it. She had always known him as a hardworking man, and learning that he had lived a double life left her grappling with the idea that people can have such contrasting sides to their character. One family friend recounted that their mother admitted to having an affair with their father's brother for years. The betrayal shattered their family dynamics, and it made them realize that their seemingly perfect family life had been built on lies, and forced them to reevaluate their relationships with both their parents and made family gatherings incredibly tense after the revelation. The former coworker shared a story about their grandfather who confessed on his deathbed that he had stolen a large sum of money from his employer many years ago and had never returned it. The family had always seen him as an honest and trustworthy person, and learning this made them question everything they had known about it. The revelation also made them reflect on how often people hide their true selves behind a facade. The relative revealed to me that their mother confessed on her deathbed that she had been involved in a dark ritual during her youth that had left her feeling cursed for the rest of her life. She had participated in things she could hardly talk about, and it left her feeling haunted. So the family had always known her as a devout and moral person, so this confession shattered their perception of her. For a friend of mine told me about his uncle, who confessed on his deathbed that he had been a hitman in his younger days. He said he had taken several lives for money and had never felt guilty about it until the end. This revelation was shocking, especially since he had always presented himself as a gentle, caring person. It left my friend wondering how many people harbor secrets that can change our view of them entirely. Are you already subscribed? No? Please do, or you will miss out on all the other horrifying stories we will tell you.